Hello and welcome to the Temple Tankard. I am Jim, aka Argent Wind, and I am your host for DM&D chat here on the House of Gamers Discord server. Hey, if you're looking for a game, as always, stop in and check out our server where we have lots of D&D games. New ones starting up very recently. We're starting a couple new ones up here, I believe, later this month and into next month. So, looking for a game? Stop in, join our D&D campaigns, and see what you can find. We do some one shots available as well, and we are looking to always bring in some new DMs as well. So, if you're looking to host a game or run a game for some of other folks here, come on by and join with the team. So today we are talking about, well, I call the episode High, Low, and In Between because we talked about encounters previously in the episode and how to make encounters interesting, how to make them more lively and more engaging for players. But one of the things you run into is scaling encounters for high level, for low level, and that whole menagerie of time in between. So how do we go about scaling these encounters? There's a lot of ways we can do this, but it can be very tricky. There's a lot of factors involved. First of all, obviously level, party level, and everything else, and character level, but also the party composition. Are they heavy on casters or healers? Do they have people with they're optimized for huge amounts of damage? It really depends on who's in your party, the types of players you have, and the way they approach combat and encounters. And of course, dice rolls can throw everything into the mix. I mean, dice rolls in D&D are the chaos factor, where suddenly you have someone who's doing great and then gets crit by a monster, and suddenly they're at almost zero hit points, and they're struggling to get back on their feet again. So all those things can really throw a wrench into an encounter that you may or may not have taken into account. And so we're going to go through some different scenarios from low level to high level and some things in between to keep in mind here. And then, as always, we'll open it up to questions, and hopefully we'll have some people joining in with us here to throw some questions our way and make our second half of the show a lot more interactive. But first of all, low level. When you have those parties that are just starting out, those characters that are just getting into the mix, they've got basic gear, they don't have any magic items, their spells aren't very powerful, and they only have a few hit points. Those first level characters, a goblin with a rusty knife can take them out in 2 hits. Some of the party members, and suddenly you're struggling to get those people back on your feet again, and you have to be really careful because I will say this: it is very easy to die when you're low level characters. And it's no fun for anyone. I mean, really, if you're a type of a DM and that loves to go for those TPKs, the total party kill is easy. You just throw bigger and badder monsters at someone until they don't get up anymore. It's not hard to put a party down, but it's not fun. You end a campaign super quick. Everyone's making new characters. You're trying to work characters in and out of a campaign that's barely even started. That's not a great way to go about getting a campaign going. You want people to accomplish things. You want them to get on their feet and run and gain abilities and gain levels and learn about the world. And they can't do that if their characters are dead, obviously. So, and bringing people back from the dead in D&D is no good at lower levels either. Now, there are some things we're going to talk about later on that makes that kind of the other end of the scale. But really, going for a TPK is just not a fun way to interact with your party. I know DMs do it. I know people that are out there that's their job. Their job is to take out the parties. I'm going to put something forth here in that your job is really more to challenge the party, to give them a chance to. I'm reading a spam bot in chat there now. Um, you get a chance to really um, uh, one sec. Um, you really have a chance to let your party grow and keep things moving along. Everything's already a challenge for little party members. Um, they're already challenged by the world because there's not much they can do yet, and they don't have any hit points. Those little basic monsters can take them out. So how do you challenge them? Well, keep in mind what they can and can't do. Don't throw those high level things at them right away. Let them kind of find their way, and they're going to struggle. They're going to have players go unconscious. They're going to have people that have to get healed, and it becomes an issue of giving them a chance to do fun things without getting brutalized. And so we we work on creatures that are more level, and CR can help here. Low CR is usually a good way, although CR doesn't gets very fuzzy in the middle and higher levels here. But the thing is, low CR is not very difficult to use as a gauge. A CR one half creature, a couple of them against the party members, pretty reasonable. Those CR ones, they can be a little more difficult for them. Um, Look at the party members, how much they can do for damage, what their chances are to hit, comparing armor classes, and just see, can the party take this thing out before it kills all of them? That's something to keep in mind here when you're designing those low level encounters. And realize that they're going to struggle, they're going to have a hard time. But the thing is, they're going to level up fairly quickly at low levels. So they push that 1 to 2 to 3 fairly fast. And that third level is when they start to really get into their groove and start to move along here. Now, some DMs just jump straight to mid level, third level, fifth level, whatever, and start the campaign there with established characters. They're a little tougher. They're a little bit harder to crack. They're a little bit tougher to take down immediately. They've got a little more experience and hit points under their belts, but they have a chance at least at taking on a little bit wider variety, a little bit tougher enemies. But understand that the challenge for a low level party is getting to that point, and you don't want to overwhelm them with things that are just going to take them out before they can get there. So keep that in mind when you're designing those low level encounters. So how do you help them level up? How do you help them to get to where they need to go? Well, the idea is that if you're using experience based here, obviously the more they fight, the faster they level. But that's a difficult thing because obviously the harder things they fight that give them more experience are easier to take them out. So this balancing act of how do I get them fighting the things that are going to give them experience, but it doesn't take them out right away. And so this is where rewards come in. Their gear, their maybe some feats or some other in between level rewards based on doing things, using things like inspiration for your party members to give them that little bit of an edge. Can really help them survive encounters that might otherwise turn out really badly for them. So during that low level to mid level time, they're going to expand the types of monsters they can take on. This is where you're going to really get to know the party. You're going to see what kind of tactics they use. You're going to see what kind of abilities and spells they tend to gravitate towards, and see who goes in and fights things in melee, who hangs back, who kind of does a mixture of things, who's really doing the crowd control, and you might be surprised at which party members gravitate to what roles. But the idea there is that you're going to watch that evolution as a group and as individuals as they move through the encounters that you put forth for them. So this is why I encourage you not to rush the level up process. Make it a little more gradual. Give them time to experiment with different tactics, to figure out what role is most fun for them. You might have the bard who wants to be doing all the crowd control types of things, but he wants to mix up a little bit of melee. Or you may have that fighter who's like realizing that I'm getting taken down over and over. I need to work on my defense. I need better armor. I need some protection. I need somebody healing me. And so this is where those roles get figured out. And so if you push through those mid levels too quickly, they're getting into higher level abilities and they're getting a wider range of abilities, and they haven't figured out their tactics yet. They haven't figured out where they're going yet. So give them that time to train, literally their characters, but also themselves. How do I want to approach combat? How do I want to do things? A little uh, um, story along those lines here is when I was playing a fairly mid to high level game I was playing a wizard, and I kept getting myself in really bad situations before I figured out how to really use my spells and how to get around and how to keep myself from becoming a target too quickly or how to get away from things. And so those first like 4 or 5 sessions, I was getting knocked unconscious, I was getting in trouble, I was getting stuck in places I couldn't get out of. And so I realized that, oh, I have these abilities, I have these spells, I have these tricks that I can use. And so I was able to overcome that and become a much more valuable, conscious member of the party as time went on. And so the idea there that I wouldn't have known that if I didn't have time to figure that out. If I jumped straight to that end point there and said, "Here's your character," they're good. People are going to struggle, especially those new players. Give those new players that time to figure things out. Their characters are there's a lot of stuff on their character sheets. There's a lot of stuff to think through, and so by giving them those little the time to work through things before you add on new gear and new spells and new abilities and new feats, it gets to be too much for them. So give them that time to train up. Um, However, you're going to hit a point where you start having trouble challenging the party. They just start walking over encounters. They figure out how great whole person is, and everybody's getting hypnotized or paralyzed or slept or whatever, and encounters become really difficult. This is where you realize really quickly that a single enemy is never going to work against a party. Even enemies with legendary actions, even enemies with layer actions, if they don't have more than one target, when the party can focus fire on one thing, it's going to go down. I don't care what it is. So either have ways of getting that enemy to get more chances to do things, maybe even exploit their weaknesses, the party's weaknesses, counteract abilities using counter spell or dispel magic on things like that. And having minions that can kind of do these things to help them out. Maybe a cleric minion can heal or dispel a whole person on somebody, or you've got somebody that runs in and disrupts the concentration of the caster who's doing these things. Anything that's going to be something that's going to be a typical tactic used by party members. You have enemies who are intelligent are going to know these things. The party's figured it out. The bad guys will too. And if it's a crafty, high intelligence dragon, or if it's another adventuring party, maybe an evil adventuring party, or a group of thieves, or whatever else that, if they've been around for a while, they're going to know. Take out the healer. Take out the guy. Take out the wizard who's casting whole person, or fireball, or whatever else that. Get those guys down, get in their faces so they can't do these things before they get a chance. And so use the intelligence of your party of your enemies to make encounters more interesting and more difficult. So that mid-level range, they're starting to get better gear. They're starting to figure out their tactics. They're starting to get more powerful abilities. You have to ramp up the enemies to make it so they're still a challenge. And so, yeah, by playing them more intelligent, having recurring enemies that may know the party already because they fought them once before but got away, or they were part of a group that was observing at some point, or they had a chance to spy on the party at some point and see what they do. That can become a lot more interesting for fights down the road. And with that in mind, another way to kind of scale that back to lower level too is that realize that enemies that the low level parties are fighting aren't going to know them, aren't going to know their tactics, may not know who they are. They aren't going to be necessarily great tactically in general with each other. So a bunch of goblins running around, they may pick their targets at random. They may not focus on certain people they should. They may just go for the guy in front of them, and that's it. And or they may try to run away and then get hit and take things out there. So realizing that those little guys that uh, that wouldn't be a challenge for a mid-level party may challenge the low-level party, but they're also going to be a little bit dumber and not quite as much of a challenge that way. But as you move to those higher levels, the enemies get smarter. They start playing better. They start getting better tactics. They start getting better abilities themselves, and you have enemies that now can challenge the party. Again, numbers, intelligence, and tactics. These are ways to challenge those mid-level party members. Um, the thing about exploiting those weaknesses of a party or counteracting those abilities they use a lot because they become common tactics that are used for people at that level there. This is going to push the party to be a little more flexible. They aren't going to have the same strategy in every encounter. I just had a thing here, first time ever, the bard threw greater invisibility on the paladin. Now, normally the casters run on great invisibility, like casting spells from wherever, not getting hit. But suddenly you have a paladin running around with melee, charging into combat, smacking things, and no one can see them. They have advantage on all their attacks. They have disadvantage on all attacks against them, and they already have a high AC. And they can just keep moving around as being a complete pain in the butt as a paladin. So that tactic was something brand new. I hadn't seen it before from my party member. So it led to a very different sequence of events, a very different way to deal with this thing, deal with this person now. Now, an enemy that has fairy fire becomes an important thing because they can counteract his ability. Or enemies that have any sort of area effect abilities can suddenly drop something where they think the paladin is, and they might catch them. So again, a different type of encounter based on a different tactic. So again, that flexibility and dynamic tactics they might use comes about because they're dealing with enemies who are doing the same thing. And then we start to move to higher levels. Now, a very good friend of on our server here, our fellow DMs got a chance to play in a very high level game, a 20th level game, where they were up against this absolutely insane monster. And I got to see the stat block for this monster. I'm like, wow, this is scary. But a couple things that always hit me when I look at a big monster like this, like, was this the only thing they were fighting? Well, no, he had some minions, a bunch of high powered minions as well. So not only did he have a massive creature who's really nasty and a lot of hit points, but now he's got a number of servants that can also challenge the party. And beyond that, when you're looking at the higher level enemies' abilities, they have more area effect things that are harder to dodge. They have a much higher chance to hit. So those ACs of that paladin running around or that massive warrior in full plate, suddenly you have something that can hit it on a 8 or better because it's such a powerful creature. They have abilities that do more damage in larger areas, and it's harder to resist. So you have these ways of drawing in bigger and badder abilities that are a lot harder to counter. So the high level creatures there have these things. They've also got legendary actions that gives them more actions that take in between their turns. So legendary actions are a huge way to challenge a party with fewer enemy, but you want more powerful enemies, those big bosses. Legendary resistances. They can ignore a certain number of spells that are thrown their way. So you try to disintegrate that thing, he goes, I resist. Or you're going to try to do something to hold monster and paralyze the thing. Nope, I resist. I'm not taking that. So that legendary resistance also gives them a bunch of free get out of jail free cards. You still roll to see if they resist. Then they don't, then you burn a legendary resistance instead. So it can prolong the fight that way at the high level encounters. Layer actions for creatures that have multiple things that can happen based on them being in their layer. In a volcanic layer, maybe a blast of lava or rocks showering across the party there and doing an area effect thing that happens. Just general environmental effects, like the heat is sapping their strength, or they're making constitution saves, otherwise they're getting levels of exhaustion or something crazy like that, where they could get affected by not only the bad guy they're fighting, but the environment as well. So again, a challenge for a high level party. There's ways to do this. Also looking at enemies that have ways of getting health back, or even better, doing damage and gaining health from doing that damage. Now they're prolonging the fight by not only hurting the party, but gaining life back and getting more and more chances to keep going. Having minions that can heal them, having minions that can dispel effects on them. Again, even more of a challenge for high level parties. So you can have there's no reason not to have a multi-stage fight. The boss monster has multiple stages to it. He gets suddenly has a once he gets to a certain point in his hit bars, he changes up things and gets new abilities or more powerful. Classic video game type things. You don't want to overuse that, but it is a fun way to make a epic encounter feel more epic when suddenly the boss monster gets tougher and because it's getting more desperate. You can have things like the boss monster gets hit starts to hit a little harder, starts to hit a little bit more often because they get a bonus to hit because they're getting angrier and tougher and stronger. So again, these fights can change and morph over time to make things a lot more interesting for those high level parties. And understand that you want to think of an encounter as not just a single instance. It is a set of things happening. If they fought something earlier that day and they've only gotten a chance to short rest one time, and then there's something that they're fighting on the way into the monster's lair, and there's traps to overcome, they might need to use magic. Burning through those resources is also going to make that encounter tougher. So the idea that they go in, they've already been injured, they've already used hit dice from a short rest, they've already been burning through spell slots and or using up those class abilities they have limited number of times per day, and they're going into these encounters with a lot more depleted than they would normally have. If they walk in there fully refreshed, long rested, everything ready to go, they're gonna have a lot easier chance. But if there's a way to draw off some of those abilities, make them expend things on the way to that fight, that end fight becomes a lot more interesting because suddenly your resources are somewhat depleted. You have to pick and choose. You got to be a little more tactical. It isn't just, I'm going to throw my highest level stuff until this thing goes down. It's still not down and I'm almost out. So think of it as a marathon. You have to kind of pace yourself as a party members. And so when you start doing this, understanding that you are going to have people running through their abilities. And so that, again, challenging a high level party is about depleting those resources, about making monsters that have multiple abilities, multiple ways of gaining life, prolonging a fight, changing up the fight. And that's what's going to make that high level party not walk all over the encounter. So the whole time this is happening, from level 1 to level 20 and everything in between, and all those encounters in there, you're going to see what the party is capable of. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to their bonuses to hit, their AC, their saves, where they're strong and weak on things, and realize that if they don't do anything to counteract those become those weak points in the party that as a DM, if you know about, you can start exploiting them. Don't make it obvious you're doing it. But again, as they become more renowned, as they become more famous and more people know who they are, if they don't counteract those weaknesses, they're going to be things that get exploited. So it makes sense for you as a DM to do that. Now, again, if you have someone who always uses magic, and you throw 8 guys that are all using counter spell, that's not going to be fun. So don't stack an encounter so far against a party that they realize that you're doing it. Like, oh, you guys all do this all the time. So I'm going to have these guys here that do nothing but counteract that. That's not a great way to go. But I mean, having a little bit of that sprinkled in, it makes sense. They're doing it. The bad guys do it. Um, and so keep that in mind as you're moving forward and getting those levels there. Is pay attention to what they're doing, pay attention to what they can do, and when they're getting those rewards, realize how much that changes. Understand, you take a low level fighter with a basic like chainmail AC 15. That goblin has a +4 to hit, needs an 11 or better to hit them. Now that fighter gets plate mail and a shield. And suddenly they're going from that 15 AC to a 20 AC. Now that goblin with +4 to hit needs a 16 or better. So a massive change 25% change in that chance to hit. So understanding that now that goblin is not going to be a challenge to them. So having a goblins with some class levels or more goblins in ways of they gang up and use pack tactics or flanking or whatever they need to do to suddenly then they can become a threat again. But understand that if you don't do anything, that one change in gear, that adding some armor to the fighter means that they're going to be just ignoring most of the attacks. And that can be fun. It can be fun to have that where you have that, like, just, I am mighty and everything's bouncing off of me. It's a great moment for them. But understand, it's not going to be a challenge for them unless you do something to counteract that at some point. Otherwise, the encounter is just, I'm just sitting here wailing away on things and nothing can hit me. And I, that's only fun to a certain point. So I see only have a couple of people watching here, but let's see if there's anyone out there. Go ahead and throw some comments in the chat there. Throw some questions out there if you're watching, and as I start to wrap this part of it up. Um, so let's see who's out there. So again, to kind of sum everything up here, is scaling encounters really does come down to a number of factors. It's what the party can do from level 1 to level 20. It's what you, as a DM, pay attention to their abilities. And challenge is not just about CR. As challenge rating is not the end all be all. There are monsters that have low challenge ratings that are tough. There are combinations of monsters that make things really tough. If you ever want a really, really gross encounter, throw a shambling mound with some shocker lizards and see what happens. It's not pretty. Or flesh golems and shocker lizards, same thing. Anything that these two things help each other and make each other stronger. Look for those combinations. They're a lot of fun. And when the party encounters them, they're like, oh no, I thought this was going to be easy. And suddenly it's not. And so there's that big surprise where, oh, this thing is just whatever. It's just a little thing here. And then suddenly things are blowing up in their faces and they're having a hard time keeping track of it all and having a lot of difficulty with it. So some fun little combinations there. No questions yet, but I was hoping my buddy Zach would be here because speaking of challenge rating and speaking of high level encounters, we were coming up at the end of his campaign, and we ended up in our last session fighting what could only be described as a Zach version of Godzilla. 100-foot tall monster thing rampaging through the city. We have been fighting big, bad, scary monsters the entire campaign. For well over 2 years now we've been playing. So we have this encounter there, and this guy's rampaging through the city. We're trying to slow it down, keep it occupied, whatever we can do, so that other people can evacuate and escape from this thing as it's trying to kill everybody. Well, my fighter, big tank, Goliath, fighter, paladin, decides to go ahead and, well, goad this thing. And I threw my attacks up there. I hit it, did a little damage, and then it proceeded to wail on me with 4 attacks that did 20 something each, and my 100 and something hit points went away in a flash. And one of those attacks grappled me, and I got swallowed. And one failed con save later, my character was completely dead. So really, you run into the problem of this is something we shouldn't have fought. But that sacrifice of that character led the other party members to realize that we need to get away from this thing. We need to find some other way to deal with this. Attacking it is not an option. And that's something to keep in mind here, especially for low to mid-level players. Even going into higher levels, some things you shouldn't mess with until you're prepared. So you may have that initial encounter and just get worked. And so they have to do something to counteract those abilities to make this fight possible, or to weaken the thing to the point where it is now killable. So that's another way we can work out a challenge here is to literally have an unbeatable fight that hopefully they all get to walk away from, unless someone sacrifices themselves. But then they come back and have that challenge later on. So it's one way to kind of definitely uh, bring a different level of challenge to a party. So, question here from Dow: what type of level would you add in any other planes of existence? Good question. When you're in the other planes, what's going to be a challenge there is not so much the CR; it's also a big environment. If they're in the elemental plane of fire, they're dealing with heat and exhaustion and potentially fire damage in places like that. All the creatures they're up against are going to be they're going to laugh at those fireballs you're going to throw. Suddenly, you're having to change what those tactics you've been doing. So in terms of level in other planes, I think the party's level is not going to change, obviously, but the bad guys are going to have big advantages because they're in their home territory. So keep that in mind, as you're going to have a lot more environmental challenges for the party and a lot more environmental bonuses for the denizens of that plane of existence. So again, it's how do we counteract it? Can we counteract it? Or do we just have to figure out how to get around these things or get away from them? So the other planes add in a whole new mix of challenges and fun things there. And I think you're running around the nine hells, and suddenly everything is out to kill you if you know what you are, or try to control you or imprison you, and so you are literally surrounded by enemies. Um, so that's where like the party could try to go around fighting things, but they're probably going to get overwhelmed real quick because they're not on their home turf. So that's one way of kind of dealing with those other planes of existence there and challenges where parties going to other planes, they're in for a whole ball game. So, good question there. Another question: do you ever rescue the boss from death? How often? If so, would I do it? Absolutely. Having a recurring villain is a fun thing to do, and there's lots of ways to do it. Um, Enemies can teleport away if they have an action. If they have sort of a contingency, they can have something that would go like something that would happen, like blind the party or do something else that, and the enemy gets away that way. There's a number of ways you can do it. They're sort of classic comic book ideas of the villain escaping. But something else to consider too is that high level caster types, there is a wonderful spell called Clone, where you can have a clone of yourself somewhere in the world, and when you die, your clone wakes up. And so suddenly you can have an enemy come back because they have a clone in the world. It's an eighth level spell, I believe, there as a wizard spell. I'm not sure who else gets it, but having a clone, definitely a possibility. Um, having having villains that have minions, this is I've seen this done as well, where you have a villain who's the big bad guy, but he has a minion that looks just like him and uses the same abilities and everything else that. And so suddenly they kill him, he's dead. Oh, that's not him. That's actually him. And so suddenly you're dealing with something that's even more powerful. And so we defeated the villain. Let's go raid a sanctuary, and then they find the real one. So again, that multi-stage fight of this is just a lieutenant. This was just the mook. This is the real fight. And so again, that ways of challenging the party by having a fight in multiple stages, or even just later on, they think they've won. They go off there and they learn through something that's this the thing is still active. Um, there's still terrible things out going on, and they realize that the villain is still active. How? Oh, he's they may learn from stories or from other people that have fought this guy that he uses lieutenants that just dress and look like him, and he's actually much more terrible. Your Dread Pirate Roberts scenario, um, or the idea that this guy is only the apprentice, this guy is the master. Darth Vader, Emperor Palpatine. Um, you have this way of doing that where you have always the bigger and badder way. So even if it isn't the villain escapes, having something else beyond that villain is a big way to go. I see another person jumped in here. Aaron, good to see you. Um, so that challenge, that high level challenge there is realizing that the bad guys high level bad guys are not going to fight fair. They're gonna play dirty. They're gonna have lots of tactics that you wouldn't think of them to use. There's gonna be lots of crazy things going on with their abilities, with their spells, with their lieutenants and minions, their layers. All of these things become part of the challenge for a high level party. Um, Other questions, other things we got going on here. Um, let's see. I have one. Let me pull up from my list back here. One sec. A fun scenario for that I've seen for villains, for party members is, again, thinking of in dealing with an organization, not just a single enemy, not just a dragon. There's always a chance that there's a larger group, a cult maybe, or some sort of a guild, or assassins, or they've hired mercenaries, and there's all sorts of ways to expand an encounter beyond just a single thing. Um, so considering that is a way to challenge a party over a long period of time with what's effectively one enemy who has lots of resources at their disposal. Some question here. What are some recommendations for resources for finding out how to make higher powered villains as opposed to lower power ones? Good question. First of all, I would say the basics of it is go to your Dungeon Master's Guide, go to your monster manual, go to there, search for your highest CR creatures. Look at some of those big bad villains like Strahd or something like that, and kind of look at them as a model. You don't need to use those exact guys, but see what they have. Look at their abilities, look at their power level, look at how much damage they can put out, and think of that in other ways. Like maybe it isn't just I have this ability, I do this much damage, but maybe I have a different way of attacking, or I have these spells available to me. But you can use that as a baseline. Like this is my baseline for bad guys. I'm making someone who's as powerful as Strahd, but different. There, so that's one way of going high powered villains. Any third party resources that have those high powered, high CR things, check them out, see what works, add on to them. You can always scale them up by giving them a little bit higher chance to hit and more damage. You can always scale them up by adding some legendary actions. So anything that's going to let you take a high powered villain, and take them up even higher, and that's so you can always add on to a villain to make them more of a challenge. And then again, as mentioned before, but this is always I think super important here, is that realizing that a high powered villain has minions. They have other people that are to deal with besides just them. Because when a party comes in, 6, 7 people, you run into a huge problem of there's just nothing you can do as a single person against a party of people. You only so much you can pull off. So that's something to keep in mind here. Do you ever give do you ever power up monsters to give the players cause for concern? Absolutely. If the monster's not doing very well, like for one thing, I mentioned this earlier, but something to keep in mind here is that some monsters may get stronger as they get more hurt. They become more angry. They become more powerful. They become raging. And so that chance to hit might go up for them. They might do more damage later in the fight. As their hit points go down, their chance to hit and their damage can go up. Um, and so that's one way that you can kind of like to power up a monster when you realize that, hey, we're taking this guy down. He's going down. Oh no, he's getting stronger now. Or if you have again a multi-stage fight where suddenly, oh yeah, that's just the first wave of this monster. Now there's a second like stage of this fight where the monster turns into this thing because it's gotten hurt enough to become its second form. Um, so um, and there's always the fun thing of a shock factor of bringing the party in and putting up something that's just damn near impossible for them to hurt or even damage initially, until the party finds out what can hurt that thing. So that cause for concern of how do we take this guy down? Well, let's find out. Let's do some research. Let's see what he's vulnerable to. Let's see some legends about this person or what this thing does. So that can be a way you can, if you cause concern by powering up a monster there, or to have the monster get stronger throughout an encounter. Um, how do you combat players that are high-powered spell users? Um, More enemies. um, Really, there are lots of ways to counteract it. Having casters on the enemy side that has counterspell, that have ways of breaking concentration. Remember, if they're trying to hold person on someone and you hit them with a high powered, like a brutal attack, forcing those con saves is going to break the concentration. And so that way, again, multiple enemies to fight means that I can't focus on concentration for super long here because I'm getting hit by these other things. And so really the best way to deal with high powered spell users is to have tactics, to have anti magic, ways of counteracting magic, having spell magic, having counterspell, having just ways that they can break that concentration. Having a bad guy that has the Mage Slayer feat. You have disadvantage on all your concentration checks. So suddenly that becomes an issue of that guy's a problem, take him out. And so those high powered spell users may be tough to deal with, but they also can become targets. So keep that in mind too, to challenge those spell users. They can be vulnerable. And what they're doing oftentimes is very noticeable and can change the course of a battlefield. If I'm dropping fireballs, if I'm paralyzing people, if I'm doing crowd control stuff here, you become the target. Um, Briefly discuss how to utilize challenge rating to help power up and down your fights. Okay, so challenge rating is tricky. I mean, the idea is that you figure out your party number level there, and use a challenge rating that equals that party level. So you have four fourth level creatures that they should be able to take on a challenge rating 4, roughly. If you have five players that are fourth level, then you may need to go to challenge rating 5 or 4, somewhere a little 4 plus. So really, challenge rating is sort of a baseline, but understanding that challenge rating is less important in my mind than action economy. So if you have 6 people in a party and they're all 5th level, those fighters are throwing 2 attacks per round. Those warlocks are throwing 2 Eldritch Blasts per round. The spellcasters, even their cantrips, are doing double the damage that used to do. So now that that level of party, that the number of actions they're taking, the number of attacks they make, the damage of the spells that they're throwing out becomes way more of a factor. So if I'm one monster who has maybe multi-attack and I can attack twice, well, I attack twice, the party attacks roughly, I mean, on the order of a party of 5 could attack anywhere from 5 to 8 or 9 times. Between all their different abilities and ways of doing attacking. So I'm attacking you twice and Eldritch Blasting and then casting, and then Sorcerers doing Quicken Spell and throwing 2 spells in a round. There's a lot of actions that can burn off there. Plus they got bonus actions, and they've got reactions and all these things that can happen there. So realizing that I am one monster with one action, maybe a bonus action, a move, and a reaction, and you've got 3 times that, you're going to win. So really, CR is a baseline. It's a way to think of it. This is a creature that could be fairly tough, but understanding what's more important is how many attacks, how many actions can this creature deal out. If it's one creature with multi attack, that can attack twice, it's not going to survive long enough to do anything and to be a challenge. So you need multiple of those. So that's where having a second wave come in, having 3 or 4 up front, or maybe one of them is tougher and you have 2 weaker ones and you want to kind of do that. So I really honestly, CR is just a baseline. So I hope that helps there. Is that, and understand too, you can also, if you're fighting a party of 9th level characters, make a party of ninth level adventurers to fight them. That's what I just did last week. You guys are all ninth level, and the enemies were all ninth level. And a few of them actually were a little tougher because they had vampire abilities on top of there. So that's a way to kind of balance things out. They had abilities that were commensurate with yours, and you have a way to really challenge a party because now it becomes not just I'm one guy throwing an attack. I can make two attacks, um, but they don't equal up to the damage that the party is putting out, or the number of attacks or actions the party can put out. So thinking of challenging a party becomes a matter of equaling up to not only their damage output, but their number of actions and the number of resources they can draw on. Having those resources up for the enemy party makes it more of a fair fight, makes it more of a challenging fight. Um, with as a as I mentioned before too, is that playing mid to high level encounters, you're running into things that are a lot smarter. They've been around. Because CR is also kind of a measure of how experienced that monster is. Not only how tough they are, how much damage they can do, a lot of it is they've been around for a while. Those high level dragons, they're a century or two old. They're not dumb. They're not going to just sit there and get beat on and killed by a bunch of party when they can just fly off, or do something to turn the tide by collapsing a tunnel or setting the whole region on fire, or whatever they can do to balance the encounter, to put the counter more in their favor. Think of that as a DM. Think of that as something that can happen. That suddenly the party has to deal with that or get out of something else, and it isn't just an enemy anymore. Now it's everything else happening as well. So you can really up your challenge for the party, not just from the monster, but what from the monster can do or the other things it can bring to bear. Hope that helps there. Uh, Either questions we have. Um, so to finish on the story there, unfortunately, my fighter paladin is dead, dead, dead. But his sacrifice did teach the party a valuable lesson, and they realize now that there's other things they need to do before they can take on the big bad guy. So that's something that's, I mean, it's an unfortunate thing. I don't like that my character's dead, but at the same time, it's what he would do. He would sacrifice himself to help his friends, to help save people, or in some cases, other party members may die because they were just being dumb and they did something they shouldn't have, and hopefully the party learns from it. Um, so again, those challenges where you do have something that's an overpowering challenge, it might result in a party member dying. And so that's something you have to keep in mind, is that kind of thing, when the stakes get higher and things get more powerful, that is a very real reality. And though I mentioned this at the very start here, but to kind of bring it back around, resurrection magics and stuff like that. A lot of comments I've read and a lot of commentary I've watched and everything else about D&D is that death just isn't a concern. Between revivify, which can be done during combat, between raise dead, which you can just bring somebody back as long as you have most of a body intact, or even resurrection. If you have access to someone who's super powerful, they can just resurrect someone even from dust. Um, as long as it's been within 200 years, it's crazy. Now the cost of those spells is fairly high, and that becomes a resource that the party needs to try to get a hold of. And that's something where if your world doesn't have a lot of that resource, then it's tricky. It makes it a lot harder for the party to bring those people back. And so death becomes more meaningful based on how you limit the access to resurrection magics. I've seen games where they just don't have it. It's not done. There isn't any. Those spells aren't even on a spell list. That's brutal, but it makes for a more challenging and much more like high stakes type of scenario. So it's something to consider too. If you want to in a world that is more of a challenge, absolutely. Just remove those abilities, remove those spells from the spell list, and suddenly you have a challenge. Oh, How do you know what's okay to diminish a boss difficulty on the fly? I don't do that a lot. One thing you might consider is that a boss or I think something you're fighting here isn't doesn't always going to fight perfectly tactically well. They may not use all their actions. They may not be like super efficient. And so if the battle's going in their favor and the party is scrambling and having a hard time, they may just go ha ha ha, sit back and laugh and watch them struggle. Um, you can always do that there. You think the opposite of what scenario I mentioned before, where the monster gets more powerful as they get less hit points, you could have the monster get less powerful. They get weak, they get winded, they lose some abilities because they don't have access to it anymore because they're just too injured. Having the idea of now this person that you're this amazing swordsman you're fighting here, you cut off his arm and suddenly he's fighting with one arm and he's lost his shield. So now he's literally two less armor class and he only has one. He lost one of his abilities. You can do that to simulate the boss getting more hurt. They're bleeding, they're struggling, they're not moving as fast, they're not hitting as hard. You can always do that. Or, like I said, if the boss is doing well and the party is struggling, you can dial it back. They may just say, you're not worth my concern, and just kind of like just casually start swatting them around and not using every possible advantage they might have because they think that they have the fight worked out. And that may be a chance for the party to flee. It doesn't happen often, but there are times when it probably should. The party should leave if things get too bad. So, and just, it comes down to what is the intent of the boss? Are they defending their territory? Are they trying to take over an area? Is this a conflict that's been brewing for a long time and it's finally here? These are all going to affect how that conflict, how that thing happens. So keep that in mind too. Is like what's causing this confrontation? What are each party trying to get out of it? And that's going to help you determine how much the boss is going to be motivated to wipe out the party, and or are they just going to try to get away from these psychos who are trying to kill him? It all depends on how the conflict is set up. So keep that in mind as you go along here, as you deal with these monsters. Do I think water battles are harder to run than ground or air? Oof. Now, if you mean like water battles as in like on ships or underwater, it every environment has a different challenge, and it does make for fun challenges to mix things up, similar to being on an elemental plane or being on in the nine hells where the environment is messing with you. Being underwater has its challenges. You're not using bludgeoning weapons underwater. You might be able to use a crossbow or a stabbing weapon, but slashing weapons and bludgeoning weapons you can't really do. Casting fireball, you're not doing that underwater. I'm even going to go on a limb here and say it's really bad to be casting lightning bolt in the water. There's no mechanic for it in D&D, but it should be. Yeah, it's gonna make things really bad day for everyone if you're all in the water and someone casts lightning bolt. But mention on ships, okay? So on ships, it's funny because think of being ships as it can be it can be challenging because it's getting from one ship to another. It's fighting on a limited set of terrain with not a lot to do. You're kind of confined to a certain area. Getting knocked in the water is how do you get back out again? There's a lot of fun challenges that can really make an encounter a lot more dynamic and interesting because you have limited places to go. While on the air, if you're talking about, well, if you're flying enemies, now you're dealing with three-dimensional aspects there, and that can be really challenging in terms of like, how do I keep this visualized and how do I make this work? But there's nothing really stopping you from attacking each other as long as you have two enemies who are flying. It's just like, okay, I shoot you, you shoot me. There's nothing in the way because we're flying through the air. So really, that's where I think like being on ships in a battle is a very different dynamic, a very different way of fighting. It's kind of like being on different like floating like bits of rock in a lava river of lava. Like now you falling off is going to be really, really bad. So the idea of like just knocking someone off the rock may end the fight. Um, so that's something to consider too. Is that any change of environment makes for an interesting dynamic battle compared to a previous one. And it's fun to just mix it up occasionally. So you have times when you're on ships, you have times when you're on airships, you have time when you're flying through the air, or just duking it out on the ground here. And again, it's sort of a different in your campaign. If you're talking about a high level campaign, flying through the air is completely feasible as a means of having combat. Where being on ships, that can happen at any level. And the enemies you're fighting might be of any power level. I mean, I've seen the idea of being on a ship fighting against a dragon turtle who just smashes your ship. Now what? Get on the dragon turtle and now you're on a big shell and you're trying to attack this thing. There's some different dynamics based on what you're doing and what power level you are. Hey, I think we'll call it there in terms of that. I want to thank you guys for coming here and hanging out today. Hope you got some good information. It was fun to come up with different things for, again, challenging a party level at different levels. It's obviously making encounters dynamic and exciting, but how do you do that with different stages in a campaign? And keeping it fresh, keeping it interesting, is definitely a challenge. And so hopefully some of these things will help you out with some ideas for how to keep that challenge going and how to make those encounters interesting, not only from a more dynamic environment or types of enemies, but also just from being able to challenge the party. So I hope that you get some ideas from this. I hope you get a chance to check it out there. And again, as always, if you have any questions or you want anything you want to follow up with there, drop it in the comments below, or send me a DM through Discord. I can always either add that question if it's a big enough question. I can add it to it, make it a whole new show about it, or I can kind of go with. Bring that question back to another episode if it's a little bit more of a minor one. So um, again, thanks for being here. As always, if you're looking for games to play, if you want to become a DM, please. We all love to have more DMs in our group on our Discord. So we're always looking for more people to run campaigns, to run one shots, and we're looking for players to play in those games. So please come and hang out, join in the Discord, join in the fun, and as always, thanks for stopping by the Tumble Tankard. Good to see you. See you again real soon. Bye.